Ireland, 1922. After a long and turbulent struggle, Irish separatists have forced Britain to withdraw from most of the island of Ireland, bringing centuries of colonial rule to an end.
The Irish public are ecstatic that they have stood up to Great Britain, and the country's still standing.
But at this moment of independence, the new Irish Free State descends into brutal civil war.
The Irish Civil War is a war among fellow citizens, people who recognise themselves as part of the same community, and that, I think, captures the horror of civil war over its long history.
As the new state is engulfed by war, few regions or communities escape. Friends and families are torn apart.
Veterans refer to the Civil War as a scar on the soul of Ireland, and it leaves spiritual wounds that fester for generations.
Desperate to prove they can govern the Irish Free State, the new government officially executes 81 men by firing squad. The state's National Army acts with impunity. Young men dragged from their homes, their tortured bodies left on roadsides for families to claim. Those who resist the new state also resort to brutal tactics. Assassinations, arson, attacks on families, lethal ambushes of former comrades.
People have seen people be murdered. They've also been part of things that they're going to have to live with for the rest of their life.
The legacy of the Civil War will haunt Irish society and politics for decades to come.
Some are so embittered that they feel like the revolution has completely failed. They feel like they've wasted their youth.
It split the independence movement. I suppose it put an end to the kind of dreams and hopes that it would end in glory.
In the first decades of the 20th century, Irish revolutionaries achieved something extraordinary and unexpected. They then come close to destroying it. July 1921. Ireland wakes to a truce and peace. After 2.5 dark years of conflict, the Irish War of Independence has been suspended. People gather at Dublin's Mansion House to mark the moment.
When the truce was declared, everybody was delighted. The summer of 1921 was a gorgeous summer. It was absolutely wonderful. And between the lifting of the curfew and the disappearance of the auxiliaries and the black and tans off the street, people began to think we actually had something.
As calm settles, British troops and police return to barracks. Exhausted after years of war, some IRA volunteers go home. But others remain in the field, ready to resume the fight against Britain if necessary. The truce allows people the opportunity to do things long postponed. Parties and prayer vigils are held. People get married. Some play or watch their favourite sports. Fairs and markets spring back to life.
There was this great sense of celebration. There was a great hope that a new future of Ireland could be achieved.
As the truce settles, President of the Irish Republic, Eamon de Valera, is invited by British Prime Minister David Lloyd George for talks in London. Massive crowds and the world's press follow every step. Lloyd George informs de Valera that he is committed to securing peace in Ireland. De Valera tells the Prime Minister that the people have mandated him to establish an Irish Republic.
The Irish Republicans thought the Republic was going to deliver a complete transformation of life. Part of the problem of perhaps the excessive demonisation of British rule was that the assumption was that once you passed it off, everything would be wonderful.
The pursuit of independence in Ireland was inspired by the Enlightenment ideals of liberty, fraternity and equality, which by the late 1700s had fueled popular revolutions in America, France and Ireland. The Irish Rebellion of 1798 was soon suppressed, but its example would encourage radical nationalists for centuries to come. Constitutional nationalists in Ireland, meanwhile, including Daniel O'Connell and Charles Stewart Parnell, campaigned for the achievement of self-government by peaceful means through the political system in London. And in 1914, the Irish Parliamentary Party seemed on the verge of success when, despite intense opposition from Unionists who wished to remain within the United Kingdom, the Third Home Rule Bill was passed by Parliament in Westminster. But with the outbreak of the First World War, Irish Home Rule was postponed. Sensing betrayal and political opportunity, in Easter 1916, a small group of militant Irish separatists staged a rebellion and unilaterally proclaimed an Irish Republic. Britain easily quashed the rebellion.
Ready! Aim! Fire!
But when the British executed 16 of the rebellion's leaders and then tried to introduce mass conscription, the angered Irish public changed its mind. Now popular support moved away from Home Rule towards the goal of a fully independent republic, as advocated by the radical nationalist party Sinn Féin and the rebels of 1916.
For a lot of these revolutionaries, the idea of the Irish Republic meant the values that were included in the 1916 proclamation, whether that was the religious liberties, civil liberties, equality for all, that all would be equal. We have the question of gender equality. This was to be a state where everybody was afforded the same rights within the state and where wealth was somewhat equally shared.
The national movement that builds around Sinn Féin encompasses large swathes of society. Left, right and centre, big business and small farmers, the Catholic Church, former home rulers and the labour movement, feminists, land agitators and radicals, all coalesce around the common cause of a sovereign Irish nation.
At that moment, Sinn Féin is a very broad church, and there's kind of a joke that Sinn Féin often, its formal policy was independence first, everything else after. We can attend to those other economic and social issues after independence.
When the First World War ends in 1918, a general election is held. With its goal of an independent Irish Republic, Sinn Féin wins by a landslide. Only in the northeast is the result different. Here, Unionists, many descended from the conquest planters of the 1600s, have long rejected the idea of Irish independence.
Unionists are increasingly of the view that they might be able to siphon off some of the northern counties, which will remain in a union relationship with Great Britain. Of course, from the nationalist perspective, with a substantial nationalist minority within those 6 counties and with slight nationalist majorities in Tyrone and Fermanagh, that a 6-county demand is anathema.
So that election is very polarising, and Ireland is pulling in different directions. There's no doubt about that.
Bolstered by their mandate, Sinn Féin TDs meet in Dublin's Mansion House. Here they form an underground parliament called Dáil Éireann, and without seeking permission from Britain, they declare independence and swear an oath to defend the Republic.
We, the elected representatives of the ancient Irish people, ratify the establishment of the Irish Republic and pledge to make this declaration effective by every means at our command.
What goes on in Ireland from really 1916 and 1923 is what's going on across Europe, or even globally, in places like Russia and places like the Baltics and Finland and Poland, but also places like Mexico, China, Mongolia. You know, there are revolutions, and a kind of a common thread is ordinary working people who've been denied access to elevated positions of social status and education and financial gain have been politicized.
Republics are cropping up everywhere. Monarchies are falling. Over 20 dynasties are falling at the end of the First World War. And there's a sense of a kind of a moment of a new world being made. And there's also a sense of actually the apocalypse arriving for many of those on the right and many middle-class groups who see Bolshevism coming out of Russia as this real danger, and revolution is something that's going to spread that across the world.
The revolutionary Dáil sends a delegation to the Paris Peace Conference. Here, new nations are being formed as the Allies divide the spoils of the First World War. But on Britain's insistence, the Irish are ignored. Now, Dáil Éireann feels it has no choice but to fight to protect the Irish Republic.
The period between 1918 and 1921 is sort of relatively unusual in Irish nationalism, in the sense that Irish nationalism is usually fragmented between different factions with different political outlooks. But what you find from the general election up until the truce is that there's a real unity brought about by the struggle for the Republic.
Britain directs its overwhelming military power against the Irish independence movement. The Irish public mount campaigns of mass civil disobedience, while the IRA and the Women's Republican Organisation Cumann na mBan use innovative guerrilla tactics to attack and persistently undermine British forces. Dáil Éireann sets up courts, policing and tax collection, all in the name of the Irish Republic.
The British, they'd encountered conspiracies and insurrections, but they never encountered this consistent program of alternative administration, which meant that as you drove out, as you pushed back British power, you substituted a republican structure. That's revolutionary.
The British government responds with brutal reprisals and punishment attacks on Irish citizens, tactics that become difficult to defend as the world's press watches. Sinn Féin mounts a sophisticated propaganda war, and in America rallies the Irish diaspora to pressure Britain into agreeing a settlement. In July 1921, the British government accepts that Irish solidarity will be impossible to overcome and agrees to the truce. The carnage comes to a halt. Three months later, De Valera and Dáil Éireann send a negotiating team to London, led by Sinn Féin founder Arthur Griffith and 31-year-old IRA and Dáil Éireann leader Michael Collins.
They are arriving as equals. That's how they hold themselves. That's how they stand out. They have lost their deference to the imperial masters of the world.
In Downing Street, the Irish face a powerful team, led by David Lloyd George and Secretary of State for the Colonies, Winston Churchill. In response to the Irish demand for a republic, Lloyd George is clear: full sovereign independence will not be granted.
There was no question at any stage of Ireland getting a republic. That would be a confession of total, utter British defeat. It would demoralise British at home. It would undermine British control and authority in the empire.
Instead of an independent republic, Britain offers the Irish dominion status. They can have self-government, but must remain within the British Empire.
So you will have a status like Canada, South Africa, Australia. And the British are absolutely insistent that the Irish are getting a good deal. And they know that in terms of elite opinion in Ireland, if you had asked anyone from 1916 to 1921 whether Dominion status was a generous offer, they would have said it's an incredibly generous offer.
Crucially, the British team insists that Irish elected representatives will have to swear allegiance to the British sovereign.
It was an oath of allegiance to the British king, and that was hugely problematic for Republicans.
In Northern Ireland, Unionists and Nationalists watch anxiously as the talks unfold. In 1920, before the end of the War of Independence, in order to assuage Unionists, The British government had introduced the Government of Ireland Act, which divided the island into two polities. Southern Ireland, consisting of 26 counties, and the 6-county Northern Ireland, which was to remain part of the United Kingdom.
The British claim to the 6 counties was clearly demographically, electorally, ethically problematic. At least 2 counties had clear majorities in favour of incorporation in the Irish Free State, and all the border areas, without exception, would have preferred to have been part of the Irish Free State.
Northern Ireland Prime Minister and Unionist leader James Craig fears the treaty will result in Southern Ireland being granted parts of Northern Ireland's territory where Catholics are in a majority. David Lloyd George's coalition government relies on the support of pro-Unionist Conservatives in Westminster. They side with the Unionists. The Irish border must not be altered. To ensure that the negotiations don't fail on this issue, Lloyd George proposes the establishment of a boundary commission. It will examine the issue of border territory at a later stage.
I think that the Boundary Commission is sold by Lloyd George very smartly in December 1921. He implies to Unionists that there is likely to be minor revisions falling out from the Boundary Commission. He indicates to Nationalists that this will be a substantial recalibration of the border between Northern Ireland and the South.
As talks continue into winter, the Irish delegates travel between London and Dublin, taking counsel from Dáil Éireann and De Valera's cabinet. But even so, the IRA, Cumann na mBan and the wider public are not informed that a republic may not be achievable.
There's a real failure to dampen expectations. It was clear in the words of Lloyd George, it was clear in the words of Churchill at the time. Irish unity, yes, but Irish unity within the empire. It's not the independence that the hardline military, those who had given most in the field, is not what they had fought for. The republic is what they had fought for. And any negotiation was going to fall short of that republic.
Huge failure of leadership, both collectively and with respect to De Valera. It was a huge failure of leadership.
Late in the negotiations, the talks come close to collapse. Lloyd George delivers an ultimatum: sign or return to immediate and terrible war.
There were serious plans for a drastic form of warfare. And of course, the British were prepared to fight.
In Dublin, De Valera and the cabinet are ready to assess the final terms, but no telegraph comes from London. The delegation has decided to exercise their powers as plenipotentiaries. At 2:15 a.m. on December the 6th, 1921, the Irish co-signed the Anglo-Irish Treaty with their British counterparts, without seeking permission from Dublin.
I think by the time we get to December 21, Arthur Griffith, but also Michael Collins, felt that they had achieved the substance of independence and that that was an agreement that they could bring home and sell.
The Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 provides for the establishment of an Irish Free State as a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. The new Irish Free State will have many of the freedoms of an independent state, including its own army and control over its finances. But this is no republic. It is a dominion of the British Empire, and the island will remain partitioned. The signing brings hope, however. Perhaps at last, Ireland's long, difficult struggle with Britain is reaching its end. December 1921. The Irish public greets the conclusion of the treaty negotiations with relief and optimism. In America, where many among the diaspora have supported the Irish nationalist cause for decades, there is also profound relief.
Initially, there was a flood of telegrams. There were all kinds of people responding to the news of a treaty, and much of the initial response was very positive. The view from afar was that this treaty meant peace, it meant sovereignty, that this was the culmination of the revolution.
As Christmas nears, Sinn Féin TDs gather at Earlsfort Terrace in Dublin to debate the terms of the treaty. The treaty must be passed by a majority of Dáil Éireann if it is to become law. Outside, every word spoken inside is interrogated and discussed.
It's a very rare thing for a country that's on the precipice of something as enormous as independence to stand around for 2 weeks and discuss what this means. There's huge emotion and lots of venom because there's so much at stake.
Among the first to speak is Michael Collins.
As one of the signatories, I naturally recommend its acceptance. In my opinion, it gives us freedom. Not the ultimate freedom that all nations desire and develop to, but the freedom to achieve it.
Over the 2-week-long debate, there are profoundly divergent views amongst the 124 TDs.
It seems to me that the taking of those oaths is a moral surrender. It is giving up the independence of our country, and that is the main reason why I object to this treaty. The Republic is not dead and will not die.
They have been mandated by the electorate to fight for a republic, but they're now dealing with something that falls far short of that republic.
Significantly, Eamon de Valera stands against the treaty.
The treaty is not a stepping stone, but a barrier in the way of complete independence. Britain will hold us to that contract.
Now, the precious solidarity that had sustained the independence movement starts to tear apart.
The argument is made by several of the anti-treatyites that agreeing to the treaty will be the first time that Irish people have voluntarily agreed to be part of the British Empire. This means we'll be complicit in the oppression of other people within the empire. The Indians and the Egyptians, for example.
As tensions mount, some raise the spectre of war.
I do not want any fighting unless it is absolutely necessary. But if the conditions were that our people must become British subjects, I would say, I am not going to agree to that.
Though no TD is wholly satisfied, there are many who argue that the treaty should be accepted for pragmatic reasons.
The treaty seems to me to re-establish justice, to secure peace at home and goodwill with all nations, and to constitute a national polity with equal rights and opportunity for every citizen.
The argument was, give us the time to do this, to build up the state, to build up the army, to build up the economy.
When TDs return to their constituencies for Christmas, the Catholic hierarchy seizes the moment to make its position clear.
The people of Ireland, by a vast majority, are in favour of the treaty, and in a democratic country, the will of the people is the final court of appeal.
Now, the role of the Catholic Church is very important here, of course, and the fact that the whole elite kind of row in behind the pro-treaty side, the Catholic Church gives its blessing to it.
Newspapers almost universally endorsed the treaty, as do most of the pre-revolutionary elite. Civic and political organisations also used the Christmas break to influence the debate.
We, the Inishowen Rural District Council, appealed to the TDs for North Donegal to ratify the treaty. The desire of the people is for quietness.
On January the 7th, 1922, with the Dáil reconvened, Arthur Griffith makes the closing argument.
I belong to the Irish people. They are flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone. I say now to the people of Ireland that it is their right, for the first time in 7 centuries, to take their place amongst the nations of Europe.
Crowds wait in the cold outside as the Dáil votes. The result is tight. 64 deputies are pro-treaty, 57 are anti-treaty. Days later, anti-treaty TDs, including Countess Markievicz, Cathal Brugha, Margaret Pearse and Eamon de Valera gather for a defining photograph. On January the 14th, the pro-treaty TDs established the Provisional Government of the Irish Free State. On de Valera's resignation, Arthur Griffith is elected President of Dáil Éireann. Michael Collins becomes Chairman of the Provisional Government of the Free State. Within days of the treaty's ratification, the British withdrawal begins.
One of the most important arguments on the pro-treaty side was that the treaty offered for the first time the prospect of the British military leaving most of Ireland. And that was huge.
After centuries of occupation, there is jubilation. British forces are leaving Irish shores. Thousands of Republican prisoners are released en masse. British Army administrative and support systems also close and depart. It causes economic hardship in places that had long thrived as garrison towns. But despite the British withdrawal, discontent builds throughout the movement.
The treaty was a watering down of all that we ever fought for. And to take of life, to me, was a very, very serious matter. I didn't do it lightly. But I wouldn't have given one night of the bed or hurt anybody for the getting of the treaty.
They would have seen the symbolism. They would have seen the crown. And in British constitutional theory, the crown is sovereign. Does that mean that the new Irish state is not sovereign? Dominion status, does that mean we are not an ancient European nation, but a former British colony like Canada or Australia? And then, of course, the question of the oath.
I couldn't swallow an oath of allegiance to the King of England. Not today. Couldn't swallow it. I couldn't do it. Not for £1 million could I do it. Not for all Ireland could I do it.
As division spreads, the Republican Women's Organisation, Cumann na mBan, meets to vote on whether to accept the treaty. Of 482 women present, just 63 vote pro-treaty. These women leave to establish a new organisation, Cumann na Saoirse. The remaining 419 anti-treaty women declare they will resist the Irish Free State any way they can.
They go back to the foundation stone, I think, of Republican women on looking at the future, which is, what did the proclamation say? They do have some very idealistic notions of the freedom that women had in Gaelic Ireland, but the treaty brings us to somewhere else. We're under the English king. We're not going to get our freedom.
Five weeks later, IRA leaders from across Ireland meet in Dublin to have their voices heard on the treaty. The government has banned the gathering. Many arrive armed, unsure of what to expect.
We were great believers then, in the power of the gun alone to cure all our evils.
As debate rages, strong support for the pro-treaty side is evident among the Eastern and Midlands divisions of the IRA. They include members of Michael Collins's former squad and the Dublin Brigade, which was particularly effective during the War of Independence. Many of these IRA men joined the new National Army. They will fight for and protect the Irish Free State. But the largest and most powerful units of the IRA, the Southern and Western divisions, stand firmly against the treaty.
It's estimated up to 70% of the IRA were opposed to the terms of the treaty. Many of those who see themselves as soldiers of the Republic don't care what the politicians think or what the politicians say.
Vowing to defend the Irish Republic by force if needed, The anti-treaty IRA elects an executive which immediately repudiates the Irish Free State. Now two competing armies jostle for position in the new state, the National Army and the anti-treaty IRA.
So there's a vacuum there left by the British when the army leaves and the police leave, and there's a fight to fill that vacuum between the two sundering sides of the IRA.
Anti-treaty IRA occupy evacuated barracks. Within weeks, they control 2/3 of the towns, villages and cities across the country.
And in fact, the National Army write to British General Headquarters and complain about how quickly they vacate from the main barracks in Limerick City. So quite bizarrely, after 750 years, the British have left Limerick too soon.
Although they control most of the territory of the Free State, the anti-treaty IRA leadership is divided about what to do next.
Option one is declare a military dictatorship and seize control of the new provisional government, arrest all those political leaders and attack the emerging National Army. That's option one. Option two is you seek a compromise and renegotiate the terms of the treaty.
There are at least two camps. Hardliners like Ernie O'Malley, who are perfectly willing to fight a civil war and to engage old comrades militarily. There are more moderate influences, the likes of Liam Lynch, who will do almost anything to avoid civil war.
Newly appointed as IRA Chief of Staff, Liam Lynch, a former shop assistant and one of the most successful guerrilla leaders of the War of Independence, hopes he can convince former comrades who have joined the pro-treaty side to reunite. Together, perhaps they can force Britain to renegotiate the treaty and grant a republic. But hardliners, led by Rory O'Connor and Liam Mellows, believe only radical action will work.
O'Connor and others saw themselves as uncompromising Republicans who believed ultimately that if defending the Republic meant attacking the new administration, then so be it.
In April, the hardliners lead 200 armed IRA volunteers into the forecourts. Here, in the seat of judicial power, they establish the anti-treaty IRA Executives HQ. Crowds gather on the banks of the Liffey to watch. Inside, IRA men pose for photographs. In London, news that the IRA have taken the forecourts worries Winston Churchill. Churchill has been made responsible by the British government for ensuring the Free State is successfully established.
In April 1922, Winston Churchill writes to Michael Collins and says the provisional government must assert itself or perish and be replaced by some other form of control.
But the National Army is as yet too weak to take on the might of the anti-treaty IRA. And the provisional government is already busy putting out fires on other fronts.
This is a power vacuum. We are lacking in effective policing and effective justice system, so there is this degree of chaos.
There was violence. The country was awash with handguns, and bank robberies were endemic.
Where there was order, chaos rears its head. Friendship and trust give way to bitterness and suspicion. The guns which did such good service against the usurper are now flourished in the faces of Irish citizens.
Years of war and political neglect have left the Irish economy weak and impoverished.
It's estimated that up to 130,000 people were unemployed in Ireland in the first half of 1922. People have very obvious material concerns. What they desire is normality. They want an opportunity for bread and butter issues to be addressed.
Angry workers call strikes and declare Soviets. Railways are brought to a halt.
What you're seeing in organized labor is a desperate effort to resist wage reductions across all industries. This takes very militant forms, and you start seeing sabotage.
There's a real fear of civil war in this moment. There's a fear that civil wars can lead to unintended consequences, that Bolshevism can creep in. Everybody is aware of the Russian Civil War and the violence and the atrocities that came with that.
Across society, there are demands for law and order. People are unsettled by the lack of governance. Support grows for the provisional government.
There's very quickly an alignment of forces whereby the pro-treaty wing of the Free State identifies itself very strongly with the employers, the press, the middle class, the property owners, the big farmers, the church, big business, all row in behind the treaty. So there's a very clear class dimension. Even though the treaty split isn't a class split as such, there's a very clear class dimension evident.
Throughout March and April, political leaders on all sides travelled the country to consolidate support.
People were hungry to hear from politicians, so when Collins and De Valera went around talking, they garnered huge crowds of people.
In order to achieve freedom, these men would have to march over the dead bodies of their own brothers. They will have to wade through Irish blood.
Mr. De Valera and his friends are stepping into the shoes of the departing enemy by attempting to prevent, in their autocratic manner, the right of the Irish people to rule themselves.
When Collins addresses a rally in Cork, fights break out. Shots are fired. For the young polity of Northern Ireland, the first months of 1922 are also marred by chaos, sectarian attacks and killings. By April, 127 Catholics and 72 Protestants have been killed. Such events strike terror among both Catholic and Protestant communities.
There are sectarian outrages in reaction to events that had occurred in the South. Very extensive expulsions of cultural Catholics from factories and from premises and places of work. And at the same time, you get burnings and shootings.
What we see is a tit for tat, atrocity for atrocity. And for the population, that is terrifying.
Look, there is massive conflict in the streets of Belfast. There is a civil war going on in the streets. It's pretty brutal. It's worse for Catholics because they're the minority.
To protect his polity's status within the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland Prime Minister James Craig introduces the Special Powers Act, which gives police extraordinary powers of arrest. Craig also forms a new armed police force.
What Craig does is, in effect, to convert the Ulster Volunteer Force veterans of World War I into a special constabulary, divided into 3 units, A, B, and C. It's the B specials that are most remembered, because these were the least disciplined.
Fearing the escalating violence, thousands of Catholics flee south to the Irish Free State.
Dundalk, Drogheda and particularly Dublin see the arrival of thousands of people, often women and children, in the spring of 1922.
Motivated to help Northern Catholics and to undermine Northern Ireland, Michael Collins and Liam Lynch arrange for weapons and funds to be sent to the IRA in the north.
Collins is playing a very deep double game here with his Northern Irish IRA offensive. If they can reignite a kind of sense of togetherness through attacking Northern Ireland, that somehow that will avoid the civil war.
Michael Collins and James Craig enter talks to de-escalate tensions. But in secret, Collins continues to supply guns to the Northern IRA. By late April, in the Free State, fears are rising. Perhaps civil war is unavoidable.
You've got clashes in Kilkenny, where several people, including civilians, are killed. And in Athlone, where Free State Army General George Adamson is killed.
Throughout the state, people try to halt the slide to war. The Irish Trade Union Congress strikes in a call for peace.
Every part of Ireland, workers lay down tools, so it's a real sense that workers across Ireland, the labour movement and trade unionists in general, are absolutely opposed to the way that this is going.
A lot of voices try to stop this. Anti-treaty IRA leaders, National Army generals, bishops. There's a women's peace movement.
In May, moderate anti-treaty IRA officers call for calm. IRA Commandant Sean O'Hegarty is invited to address the Dáil.
What does civil war mean? That you break the country so utterly that England simply walks in and has her way. You will destroy any idea of a republic.
A general election, the first in the Free State, is scheduled for June. In an attempt to stabilise the political situation, Eamon de Valera and Michael Collins negotiate a pact by which pro- and anti-treaty Sinn Féin candidates will stand together as a coalition. To ensure the IRA supports the election, Collins intimates that the oath of fidelity will be dropped from the new constitution of the Irish Free State.
This was yet another attempt by Collins to find some way of keeping the two factions of the IRA together.
That's what really terrifies London, because it looks like the reconstitution of Republican unity, and the reconstitution of Republican unity might mean a settlement which tears up the treaty.
The British talk about the emergence of a republic as a thing that might just happen any time now. Then the army will have to go back and it will be a war.
May 1922, the Donegal-Fermanagh border. The IRA, in another assault on the territory of Northern Ireland, occupies the villages of Billeek and Pettico. This time, Churchill is ready. 2 battalions of troops have been moved into Northern Ireland. They unleash an overwhelming assault on the IRA. After 5 days of fighting, the IRA retreats. Britain's point is made. Northern Ireland must not be touched by either the IRA or the Irish Free State. Even so, watching from Westminster, Churchill remains wary.
The British really feared that Collins would eventually go over to the Republican side. The fact that these endless conversations between all the elements of the IRA, that kind of fueled this British paranoia.
Churchill orders General Macready, commander of the remaining British forces in Ireland, to be ready for war should any attempt be made to establish an Irish Republic. He then informs Collins that the oath must be included in the Constitution.
It's the rejection of Michael Collins' effort to produce a Republican Constitution on the British side, a rejection based on the renewed threat of war. It's that rejection that I think makes civil war much more likely.
The new constitution is released on the morning on which the general election is held. Despite Michael Collins's intimations to the contrary, the oath remains, and the status of the new Irish state within the British community of nations is confirmed. When the results are counted, though many seats were uncontested, pro-treaty Sinn Féin candidates have won 58 seats and anti-treaty Sinn Féin have won 36. The Farmers' Party wins 7 seats and Labour wins an unprecedented 17 seats. Viewed solely on their treaty stance of the first preference vote, while anti-treaty candidates win just 22%, pro-treaty candidates have won 78%.
If you look at the election as a referendum on the treaty, the sense is that this was a fairly substantial public vote in favour of the treaty, and that was very much to the benefit of the provisional government going forward. And I think it strengthened their hand.
This huge pro-treaty vote alters the political calculus. Newly confident, the provisional government abandons the idea of the coalition pact. Enraged, the anti-treaty side claims that Collins had betrayed their goodwill and that the election had been influenced by Britain's threat of a return to war. But business, farmers, the Catholic Church, along with the majority of the people, see the results as a mandate for peace and the legitimisation of the provisional government.
The result is an indication of the good sense of the people, the will to replace the rule of the gun by ordered government.
Six days later, British war hero and Unionist MP, Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, nears his home in London, having unveiled a war memorial. Lying in wait are 2 young IRA operatives, who are also British Army war veterans, Joseph O'Sullivan and Reginald Dunn.
Henry Wilson was spectacularly assassinated by 2 IRA men, one of whom had a wooden leg and couldn't run quickly. They were both captured.
Wilson is assassinated in what's really the world of the elites in London. And so the idea that a man of his status could be killed on his own doorstep in Eaton Square, one of the grandest addresses in London, sends shockwaves through the cabinet. They all fear that they will be next. They all live in the same area.
Though it remains disputed who authorised Wilson's assassination, the British cabinet blames the IRA in the Four Courts. Churchill orders Macready to prepare to attack the Four Courts. Macready warns Churchill that a British attack within the Free State could reunite the Republican movement against Britain.
Macready convinces Churchill to ask Collins to do it, to make the provisional government do it.
The British government basically turned to Collins and said, if you don't do something to get those out of the Four Courts, then we will.
Churchill finds Collins and the provisional government unexpectedly willing to act against the anti-treaty IRA.
The British government wanted action, but so did Collins. He had now the support of the people, 78%. He had his mandate. Now was the time to strike, and he was confident that he could win quickly.
The provisional government sends word to Churchill. They will attack and force the anti-treaty Republicans from the Four Courts. But the National Army is hardly ready for war.
We had about 8,000 men in the army at the time, but only around 6,000 were armed. The machine gunners had to be taught how to handle the guns the night before the fight.
With rifles, machine guns and field guns supplied by Britain, the National Army surrounds the Four Courts. Artillery is placed strategically on the southern banks of the Liffey and behind the 1,000-year-old St. Michan's Church to the north. On the night of June the 27th, Collins issues orders. The attack begins at dawn.
It happened quite suddenly and quite violently, really, in that they were given an ultimatum to evacuate the four courts. They were given 20 minutes to evacuate the building, which wasn't practical, it was not going to happen. And then the four courts is bombarded at 7 minutes past 4 on that June morning.
As shells fall in the four courts, those inside prepare for the worst.
The boys all knelt down and recited a decade of the Rosary in Irish, placing themselves under the protection of the Blessed Virgin and all patriot martyrs of the Irish Republic.
With superior firepower, National Army leaders are certain the conflict will be short-lived. But something fundamental has changed. The Free State attack against the four courts has compelled moderates to choose sides.
The moderate militant wings of the IRA had been talking to each other. And as soon as they launched that attack on the four courts, the moderate wing decided that they were going to stand by the Republic.
United, anti-treaty Republicans can draw on up to 80,000 men to counter the forces of the Provisional Government. Having ended British occupation in most of the island, now Irish will fight Irish to decide the fate of the Irish Free State.